When we study biogeography and biomes, one of the major concepts we need to consider is ecology. And if we want to be even more specific, we can take a look at the different levels of ecological study. This is pretty important because we want to learn about how organisms interact with each other in different biomes, habitats, and communities. Chances are you've heard those terms in regular conversation, but today we're going to really understand them from a biological perspective. Let's start by observing the dynamics at 5 major levels. Let's start at the basic level. 1, we have organisms. So we consider an individual organism, be it a human, a horse, a plant, etc., and then we ask ourselves, how does an individual organism interact with its environment? What is its diet, and can it survive in different temperatures? Things like that. 2, populations. These are groups of individuals of the same species. We need to ask ourselves, what causes population density to change over time? 3, community. How do interactions between species, such as commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism, come into play? What about predation? 4, ecosystem. What happens to when we combine the interactions with the environment with those between species? Today we'll be really focusing on this, especially when we start to talk about different factors that affect the ecosystem. And last we have 5, the biosphere, or Earth as a whole. How do global events such as global warming change climate and resources on the entire planet? Answering these questions will help us understand the world around us in a more scientific way. If you're studying to become, say, a biostatistician, population data will be really useful. Or if you're a behavioral researcher, studying interactions between species would be a key component of your work. To understand all this, we need to consider what affects the distribution of organisms within a certain geographical area. This is called biogeography. 2 major factors come into play, abiotic and biotic. Let's start with abiotic. Abiotic literally means a, non-biotic living, so together, non-living. Abiotic factors are the physical and chemical conditions such as water, light, humidity, soil, etc. in an environment. So when we look at certain organisms, they can only exist in specific environments. You wouldn't expect a penguin to live in the desert, and you certainly wouldn't expect a cactus to survive underwater. Logically, because of the different biological characteristics an organism has, different species have different abiotic needs, and certain organisms can only exist and thrive in an environment that suits their conditions. Of course, the abiotic components of an ecosystem will change over time from things like natural disasters, but a population species will either have to evolve over generations to improve tolerance and population survival, otherwise they might emigrate or become extinct. This could go a variety of different ways. Okay, so that's abiotic factors. Now let's look at biotic factors. Biotic factors are the complete opposite. All things living, such as interactions with other organisms, are considered biotic factors. Competition for resources can often be a limiting factor, or vegetation, on the range of a species population. When we consider historical data, biotic factors and abiotic factors can directly affect each other. If we think about global warming, an abiotic factor associated with it would be rising temperatures. As temperatures rise, the range and niche of different species are affected. Because of warmer climates, red foxes, for example, began to hunt Arctic foxes, even though they originally had completely separate niches and were not in a prey-predatorial relationship. This would be considered a biotic factor, this relationship. While we're on the subject of global warming, let's look at some more abiotic factors, climate and weather. We want to note the difference between the two. Climate is a long-term prevailing weather condition, whereas weather is a short-term atmospheric event. So climate is long-term, weather is short-term. Just remember that. But why are some parts of a continent wet and other parts dry? Different climate patterns are caused by wind cells. There are 3 different types of wind cells, one for every 30 degrees north or south of the equator we go. We have Hadley cells, Ferrel cells, and polar cells that are caused by the rising and sinking of cold air and hot air. This results in 3 different divisions of global air circulation. For the AP test, you don't really need to get into specifics of why each cell is distinct, but it is important to know the order and what wind cells do as a whole. These cells explain why the equator is hot, and the North and South Pole are cold. The angle of incoming sunlight is much stronger at the equator than at the poles. One important thing to note is that the Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees, approximately, so we have different seasons in the northern and southern hemispheres, instead of having consistent heating from the sun year-round, which would happen if the Earth was not tilted. Another important thing to note is that the equator gets equal sunlight all year long. The general trend is that the further you are from the equator, the colder the temperature becomes. But how do we explain why the ocean is cooler than inland, or why there can be lush forests on one side of the mountain and arid deserts on the other, such as the Sierra Nevada? This is because, one, water has a high specific heat, which means that it stores heat energy really well, so the side of the mountain facing the water is generally going to be a lot cooler. But if we go more inland, there aren't as many bodies of water, and the temperature will significantly increase. And one more important thing to note is that with mountains, we often have rain shadows. So this is what's happening with the Sierra Nevada, what we mentioned earlier. Moist air from the ocean side of the mountain will rise over a mountain range, cooling that side and condensing water vapor. After it passes the peak, there's little water left to create rainfall, resulting in the rain shadow. So imagine that you're on you see two sides of the mountain. One side will have a lot of rainfall and the other side will be the arid desert. This is what happens with a rain shadow. After passing the peak, we see two completely different climates within close vicinity to each other. Now that we know about abiotic factors, biotic factors, climate patterns, and weather, it's important to understand how they affect the major types of terrestrial land biomes. Aquatic biomes have additional factors to consider, but we'll get to that in another video. The important land biomes to remember are tropical wet forest, subtropical deserts, temperate grasslands, temperate forests, boreal forests, and Arctic tundras. It's important to understand how these biomes differ, especially when we consider the global climate changes that occur as we speak. Sizes and populations may shrink or grow, which affects the entire ecosystem and eventually our environments as we know it.